Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for a panel discussion here. We're going to be talking about business benefit. You heard a lot about network automation and all the intricacies of. And one of the key things here is really what the business benefits are, because at the end of the day, if there's no ROI, a business is not going to do network automation, is it? And joining me today, we have a panel of esteemed guests. I'm going to have them introduce themselves briefly. We'll start with Gent. Gent, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, I'm Gent Atkinson. I head up network strategy and digital architecture at SES. We're one of the largest satellite content and connectivity providers that offer service worldwide. And we're really on the forefront of being able to deliver the best capabilities in terms of fiber from the sky and content being delivered everywhere.
Excellent. Thank you, Gint. All right, over to you, Francis. Francis, would you like to introduce yourself and your firm?
Hi, yes, I'm Francis Haste. I'm a principal analyst with Apple Research, which is a research company really focused at network automation and the opportunities that are driven by the increasing softwareization of the network. From a background point of view, I've headed up ROI practice or created ROI practices at some major vendors like Kramer Systems, Amdocs, and Telcordia Ericsson, and I currently drive a number of ROI practice within the consultancy company.
Excellent, thank you, Francis. Next up, we have Nico. Nico, could you introduce yourself, please?
Yeah, thanks. Hi, everyone. I'm Nico Walters. I head up innovation and information here at CMC Networks. CMC's been one of the largest Pan-African network service providers for the past 30 years. We provide MPLS, SD-WAN, carrier Ethernet across 110 POPs globally, focusing predominantly on the Middle East and Africa.
Excellent. All right, next up we have Carlos. Carlos, if you could introduce yourself.
Yes, my name is Carlos Tang. I'm with JPMorgan Chase, a global financial services firm. I invest in banking as well as commercial banking and consumer banking. My role at JPMorgan is I lead up the software-defined networking team. And my professional background has been a mixture of infrastructure and a lot of software engineering.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, panel. Thank you, Carlos. Let's kick it off. So, some people may ask, why do we need to justify network automation, right? Do we need to make a business case for network automation? Is it just a natural evolution of network operations? And we'll kick it off with Nico. Nico?
Yeah, thanks, Roy. I think, first of all, with the adoption of a lot of software-defined technologies within networks, people have kind of assumed implicitly that we need automation is just there. But because of the investment, and it's quite a substantial financial investment that's normally involved and time and effort, the business case becomes invaluable. And for a couple of reasons. One of them is not just the financial impact that you need to work out what's the investment, what's the ROI, the normal things CFOs want to hear, but also gives you an opportunity to really do the discovery of your network, the processes, the business operational processes, and actually see what is, what can we automate? Is it worth it? So I think that business cases are just exceptionally important, not just from a pros and cons, but in general, just to find out what we need to do and how we do it.
Oh, excellent, Nico. Francis, what's your thoughts on this?
I would totally agree. I think a business case is always critical, but I'd really sort of emphasize it as almost a thing to make sure that you're doing the right thing, not the wrong thing. A network operational evolution, I think there's always a danger with that you're always going to drive mechanization, not automation, and that there's a critical difference between those two things. The age-old statement of the car as a more powerful horse is always implied in a sort of we're going to evolve how our operational teams work, and I think by creating the business case you can not only make sure you're grounded in terms of the business case, but also actually you can focus on things that you may not have thought of in terms of just the low level way you work the business at the moment.
Got it. Well, thank you, Francis. What about Carlos? What are your thoughts? You're at a financial institution. Do we need to make a business case for network automation?
Well, I would say kind of building on what Francis said, right? It's very important to think about, what is it that you're automating, right? I think a lot of times people will jump into automation, right, as sort of simple, almost like simply automating task that a person would have done, right? And then it's almost like a slippery slope. And the next thing you turn around and you're actually building software. And that time actually comes much faster than you think. So from my standpoint, actually, there is definitely a business case for automation, but I would say that the other very important thing to think about is, think about it like from a business standpoint, and say to yourself, it's almost like when you think about software, where you're thinking about build versus buy. And early on, you should say to yourself, am I more on the build side or more on the buy side? And what's going to be my threshold where I'm going to say like, okay, hey, I've done a certain amount of automation. Maybe I can do more, but should I really be doing more?
Well, I think that's really fair, right? I think those are good questions to ask, right? It's the why. It's not just jumping blindly into it and just, let's just make it faster, better, and what is better, right? And that's absolutely right. So what we're going to do is actually, with that kickoff, we're going to talk about an ROI. We're going to talk about the I component first, right? So before we get started with the R, let's talk about the I. How do we quantify the cost and investment capture? So maybe from both a business and a technical perspective, right? What are some of the best practices in trying to capture the costs and investments required in network automation? And let's start with Francis.
I'd actually sort of step away. The critical thing, I think, for all aspects of the ROI is, and I've always generally done this from a vendor perspective, is the difference between customer engagement and customer involvement is that you will truly understand what it is, the costs, the real challenges, etc. If you have an engaged customer, business, whatever part of the business. I think specifically within telcos and within necessarily it is a large part driven by the way operations work. You need cross-operational silo sponsorships. Telcos are very operationally siloed: planning, engineering, troubleshooting, NOCs, etc. So I think, and the real costs only come about, or the real benefits only come about when you combine those things together. And planning sees the effects of what they do on troubleshooting, and troubleshooting sees the effects that they have on operational. I think if you've got that kind of structure, the detail will necessarily come out of it. And sort of continuing that is, you need operational stakeholders throughout the process.
I think that's very fair. So breaking down silos is one of the key elements to that. So speaking of service providers and telcos, you're a service provider. What are some of the best practices you've seen in terms of trying to capture the cost and investment envelope?
So in my current situation, I reflect back 20 years. Back when I was at VoiceStream T-Mobile USA. And at that point, over-the-air upgrades to the handset were becoming mass market. And, the handsets could upgrade the entire protocol stack on the fly. So you could go from GSM to the next generation. And back then, you can imagine the tremendous impact that that had. And, you think back then to what we were doing over the next 5 years, which is really bringing dramatically new applications with deep consumer customer engagement. We had to do that. Now we fast forward to today and serving remote enterprise customers in the middle of Africa, a big operation that needs 1 gig worth of connectivity in the middle of Africa. And, we would expect that we could do over-the-air upgrades of the customer services, the terminal infrastructure, and anything that's software-based. And we're not exactly there. We're pushing to get there. And what I'm driving at is the radical disparity in the cost of servicing a customer and sustaining those customer services and upgrading those customer services over the life of the contract and the extension of the contract.
Got it.
So, I think one of the big things is that in different sectors, when you're serving B2B and you have extremely big, large revenue relationships versus where you have tiny revenue relationships across millions of customers, we see a difference in adoption. But the key thing that I'm driving at is when you're on the consumer side, when you have tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands or millions of customers, your cost accounting is going to have a fidelity that you don't need to have when you're serving mega customers that are, millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars in revenue per year. So this really gets back to having a close grip on detailed cost accounting. What are your process costs in time, expenses, and everything else? And this is the beginning of the discipline. And I'm experiencing a lot of situations now where we're talking about automation, and we've got to do a lot more work to get the basic numbers. How much does it cost in time, labor, and money? And this is the start.
That's fair. So two elements to that. I think, Francis talked about breaking down the silos, and what you're talking about, what I hear is this couple of elements. One is a life cycle element, to make sure that you're capturing the cost across the entire life cycle, not just the deployment, but all the way through, all the elements of the life cycle of the service. The second thing is that in terms of capturing the cost, there is a question about granularity, as you're saying, right? The granularity of capturing the cost, and the way you approach it is different based on the type of service, right? Whether it's low cost services to a lot of people, or whether it's very high end services to a smaller number of customers, that you need to moderate your cost accounting practices accordingly, and so to speak. And in situations where there is massive scale, then the cost capture has to be done in such a way that it's cost effective to do the cost capture, right? Otherwise, or the monitoring itself, right? So I think that's what I'm hearing. But in terms of the cost, right? We talked a bit about the cost of automation, the cost of deployment, some of the software build costs, and some of the elements that I think Carlos talked about, right? Whether you acquire software, you build software, there are costs involved. But are there hidden costs as well in terms of that investment element, right? So maybe let's get started with Gent, and then we'll go over to Carlos, which is, are there hidden costs, right? Recruitment costs, because automation isn't magic. You need people with experience to do that, right? Are there costs of recruitment, upskilling costs in terms of getting your team ready to actually do automation? Gent.
Yeah. Your question is incredibly broad. There's a massive amount of costs that are hidden, and you could be forced to incur or to swallow and take them down. The disappointing thing is that you probably have a lot of control. All of us have a lot of control on a certain set. We could take those costs, get control of them, and push them out somewhere else. There's another set that's really challenging, and we put it in the almost uncontrollable, right? We can't control it as well as another category. So I find a lot of disappointment in when we don't control the controllable. And I talk to our peers, our customers, our competitors, and what I get overwhelmed with is, geez, we've got the same problem. Why do we keep on reinventing the wheel when we see in maybe the top 20% of the industry, we see best practices that can be quickly and easily adopted. Many of those best practices are built into solutions that we could buy off the shelf and quickly integrate, and we don't seem to go there fast enough, and we seem to really struggle with figuring out where's the secret sauce that we need to make for our business that we have to do ourselves, and the focus, our investment on the magic, on the secret sauce, which is very, very focused. And then there's a very big part of the business that is extremely standardized, and we could adopt business practices. And that trade-off between using best practices, standardized solutions, to get the performance up to best in class, versus what makes you special. I think that's a very big problem. And we get back to how much does it cost for us to do something, and what is the tactical operational benefit, and then what's the strategic benefit? And that's getting our priorities straight and balancing out the portfolio of investment to go where it needs to go to get the maximum yield.
Yep, no, excellent. I think, very good points in terms of, focus on where the value add is. If you can buy cheap, if you can borrow it cheap, use that instead of trying to reinvent the wheel. So I think, good points, absolutely. And we'll come back to some of that later. So Carlos, maybe just a couple of words in terms of, are there hidden costs, right? On top of, I think, Gin talking about best practices in terms of controlling the cost, right? What about hidden costs? Are you seeing anything at JPMC around upskilling or recruitment issues with, trying to get automation initiatives in place?
Well, I mean, my observations here are not really JPMC specific, but rather just general industry trend that I see, right?
Yep.
I talk to kind of colleagues, right? And right, I think you mentioned something earlier on about how like automation is essentially driven by people. I mean, this is a talent thing at the end of the day, right?
It is. Yes.
And one of the things that I would say is sort of a hidden cost, at least, or maybe it's not trivial or not obvious, right? Is job satisfaction. How do you keep people motivated, right?
Mm-hmm.
Automation of networking, right, is this fascinating area where you're really dealing with a combination of infrastructure, right, that's sort of evolving into something that's more software defined. And then you're also dealing with the construct of software, right? And it's almost like a gradient you can imagine, right? Where you're sort of going from something that seems to be fairly static, right? Traditional infrastructure, all the way to like something that's like almost like the shiny future, right? Like the software defined, right? But there is a long gradient in the middle, right?
Yep.
And you're having to bring your whole team along for the journey, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think the dangerous part is like this middle part where you've gone off and you've done all of the non-trivial automation, right? Now you're getting into pieces that are really, you're touching the software, you're trying to build tests, you're trying to build like, how do you actually deploy this consistently, right? And it's almost like this middle ground where the software engineers, the people that are more software engineers may feel like, this is actually not that hard, come on, like I build a whole bunch of apps, right?
Right.
But then the networking engineers may feel like this is really challenging, right? Like I sort of like miss like the discomfort that I had before with all the infrastructure, right?
No,
and how do you manage that? How do you keep going in this direction, right?
Yes, I think that's fair. It's fair. It's taking them out of the comfort zone, right? So it's there's an element of upskilling them, but there's also an element of making sure that they're comfortable and they come along for the ride instead of getting thrown off the bus, right? Essentially, or fall off the bus, which is not ideal, right? So
and then that comfort zone, just as you get comfortable, right? You keep evolving, right?
Absolutely.
And then it gets hard again.
That's part of it. That's part of the art, right? And that absolutely, I think that's good. I'm going to move right along here, and actually, I'll go to Francis first and touch on. Are there any rules of thumb, right, in terms of investment capture before we go on to sort of the quantifying the benefits element, right? So, are there any rules of thumb that you've seen in your practice across the board? How much should we invest in automation, right, relative to project cost? 5%, 10%, 7%? Is there a simple answer? Maybe it's
as long as a piece of string, I think, is the simple answer. But I'd rather. I think I'd like to turn that question on its head. Is surely we should be asking is how much shouldn't be invested in automation, and I say that in this context of telcos. It's a slightly simplistic view of the world, but really the destinations of telcos at the moment is somewhere between a utility telco and a highly innovative service telco. Both of those endpoints and everything between requires automation to be able to deliver services that are profitable, where you're not necessarily owning every part of it, and we've seen that with the top players. So automation is absolute necessity to get to both of those places, to innovate and to be an efficient utility operator. I think it's general, but I think we've looked at some of the telco spending, and I think that is something that should be driving it. We calculate generally 15% on CapEx is being spent but that compares to about 40% on OpEx. And some of the decisions you need to be making are at the moment, automation tends to get lumped in the OpEx bucket, and it tends to get lumped in the operational bucket. So you should certainly be thinking about your costs, not just in terms of the OpEx, but in terms of CapEx to avoid that OpEx, because actually that is your bigger cost. And I think there's other aspects we can learn from that ability to think about the CapEx OpEx thing. Is if you look at the cloud providers, they look at automation from a very different aspect. They look at it from, and I'll use one example. Microsoft Azure puts data centers in a submarine and puts it at the bottom of the sea to save costs. But one of the implications of that is they never touch it again. Amazon doesn't, if it doesn't go into a data center or change anything in a data center unless a whole rack or row has completely failed. And we don't think that way. We think about optimizing, if the customer needs one port, we need one port. If we'll never think that actually I want to install 15 ports because I want the customer to consume 15 ports worth of aspect. We see all aspects of that in terms of, say, UCPE, where we invest in the smallest UCPE, not invest ahead of the thing because it's going to solve the automation. So short way of sort of saying, I think we should be driven by that, the overall telco things, and we shouldn't get siloed into OpEx in terms of the size. But I would stress, what wouldn't you be spending on automation is critical to your business.
Absolutely, very, very fair, and a very, 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 I would say, a very comprehensive view of how to approach it, and more holistic. And I think, as you point out, a lot of telcos don't take that holistic view, right? It's just me, my little box, and how to optimize this. Where in fact, globally, there's a much better way of approaching it. All right, we're going to move on to the benefits portion. So we talked a bit about investment capture. We've talked a bit about the level of investment, or at least sort of some rough rules of thumb and some approaches, best practices in terms of looking at the investment piece, quantifying the benefits. So I'm going to go to Gent on this one, which is, how do network operators value and quantify the benefits that come from network automation, right? What is it, mean time to repair? Is it downtime avoidance, right? How do you guys look at it from a service provider standpoint?
So I was just thinking of a couple of points we were talking about. And keep in mind, for example, the scale of the service. If you have an incredibly hairy network and you need millions and millions of customers to make your numbers, your scaling problems are very different from where you only need 1,000 or a few thousand customers. So in the connectivity business, let's just say selling consumer 1 gig that's highly oversubscribed versus, let's say, a global connectivity provider who has incredibly expensive submarine capacity or satellite capacity to kind of get around the world.
Sure.
And so the cost of your CapEx, the CapEx that you need to deliver your services and serve your market is really important, along with the delay that's involved. So satellite and submarine have a similar dimension in that you're talking big capacity, and you need to pay that CapEx up front long before it's ever serviceable. Right. So this is a very different dimension from being a cloud provider. And I say, take a look at what we're doing with Azure Orbital. And we're very fortunate that we've got a partnership going, and we can plan things together, but still we don't have the advantages that a pure cloud business has, which is lots of virtualization and a lot more flexibility to carve up your value into smaller pieces without a lot of effort. Whereas, take a terabit of submarine or satellite capacity and carve it up for different markets, it's not that easy. So we really need to get a grip on the entire cost infrastructure. And all of a sudden, going back to hairy networks, if you have 100 process steps to go from order through fulfillment, it's not just that you can optimize your process and make it faster and cheaper. There's another big lever. Should you be going towards selling bigger chunks of capability to bigger customers, or should you be selling very, very small pieces of capability to very demanding customers that might not, understand the business model of the ecosystem?
Right.
So
I think that's fair. That's fair again. So, but then so where does automation play a role there, right? And so if your business is big chunks versus lots of little chunks, right? Is there a different way that you would look at quantifying the benefits of automation in that situation, right? How would you look at it?
The more you need to scale, it's absolutely crystal clear pattern that you need to do process optimization. You need to reduce your process cost and reduce your process time. In other words, accelerate. So if you want to serve many, many customers with smaller chunks of your value,
right,
you're really going to have to accelerate your business process and optimize it. If you can sell in larger chunks, if it takes 100 hours to go from order through fulfillment, 100 hours of labor.
Yeah.
That's much less painful when it's a customer that's serving up 6 digits instead of 2 or 3.
Yep. So I think that's so. What you're saying is, again, here is that the valuation of the benefits that come from that is tied to the business model that you have and the nature of what you're selling. I think that makes a lot of sense. I'm going to move right along here and actually talk about. So in terms of measurement of these things, right? What are the KPIs? I'm going to go straight to Carlos and say, Carlos, what are the KPIs that we need to pick and monitor and measure them? Maybe regardless of the type of, is it independent of the type of service? I think so. Gent was talking about in different services, different level of benefits, different analysis, but is it the same KPIs? Is it different KPIs? And how do you see network operators or network folks measure those?
That's an excellent question. I mean, this is just such a big topic, right? And actually, when I thought about this particular question, right, I really reflect a lot on the industry. There's been a lot of discussion in the industry about site reliability engineering practices, right? And that's where I usually gravitate to, right? So take one simple one, which I think a lot of people are familiar with, which is availability, right? Which I've come to learn in the networking, that has a lot of connotations, right? In my particular background, it's enterprise, right? So, I'm going to start with that. For me, availability would mean availability of the business services that we're supporting through the networking, right? Because that, at the end, that's the most important bit. Is like, can you actually get to the business service that you're trying to expose, right?
Right.
So that's almost like your North Star. Then you go from there. Like, okay, so that means many things. That means you need to have capacity. You need to have actual certain amount of bandwidth. You gotta have throughput. You gotta have your compute, depending on how you've laid out your infrastructure. But sort of focusing on the business service, right, you're trying to expose, right, and then leveraging as much as possible so these industry best practices around how do you then address availability? How do you then measure it? How do you bake it into the automation you're building, right? Sure. So that it's actually reporting and saying okay, based upon I did a deployment and I can see that on my canary test, right? I'm reporting an availability of X. That to me is sort of key. So it's almost like I almost go for saying pick less measurements or maybe just one, and then really kind of focus on that one and build all of your automation and strategy around that.
That's fair. I think at the end of the day, the ultimate metric is sort of that business availability, right? If the service that you're trying to sell is not available or not ideal for the customer in terms of the experience, then you've missed it, regardless of what you're measuring. Doesn't matter that packets per second is the right rate. Doesn't matter that your packet loss is below a certain threshold. It almost doesn't matter in that case, right? So now I'm going to actually talk about, how do we then put a dollar value on these things? And I'm going to go first to actually Francis and then over to Nico in terms of, so can we assign a dollar value and compare against the alternative? And I think Francis, you talk about, what shouldn't you be spending on it, right? That in this case is there a, what if we didn't do it alternative that you can actually compare to and say, look at the A/B, right? Benefits, and A is better than B.
I think actually I'd almost say it's relatively straightforward to put dollar values on things like mean time for recovery. I've lost count of the numbers where I've said, look, such and such a product will generate you, on average an hour saving on mean time. That's actually the easy bit, but actually in one sense it kind of completely misses the point. I know you're going to talk about there's always the intangible. I think the only way that you can actually compare doing nothing is always the competition here.
Right.
Okay. And generally, actually, it wins quite well. Particularly if you're a competitive company coming in to replace something, because generally you're competing against a small upgrade to an existing system versus a complete replacement of a system or transformation. It's only actually when you bring in these intangible or more accurately indirect benefits that you can actually start to see the whole picture. So I think by way of sort of jumping ahead, but I think intangibles and indirect benefits are critical to actually the difference between an academic business case and a real transformational
I think that's fair. So I'm going to ask you now, since we're on the topic of, and we'll come back to Nico shortly, which is there an ROI calculation that you can actually effect on these intangibles?
I think you have to make a lot of assumptions on it. But the intangibles, I think what they do is the intangibles build a kind of goodwill basis for a lot of the other direct benefits. Is that if you've got the two obvious intangibles are happier staff, and if you've got happier staff, they're going to make less error rates. They're likely to be more proactive. There's a whole set of behaviors that come about when you don't have a kind of the typical NOx. The NOC today still feels a bit like the Apollo 13 mission control. It's like we're dealing with a crisis after crisis.
That's right.
That's right. Let's lower the stress will have an effect on a lot of things. And the other one is just happier customers. And magic will occur if you have happier customers. Churn will reduce. You'll be able to sell more. All of those kind of things. You can make estimates of it, but I think it's much more in terms of building the general groundswell for it. And I have a particular case in point, just how automation would have. I'm with the 3 network in the UK at the moment, and they've just got gloriously, they've put a 5G antenna 400 meters away from my house. I should be ecstatic about that, instead of which my service has gone from 4 bars 4G to 1 bar 4G. And they could not connect that up together. They've ended, there's so much that has gone wrong on that one. But just basic basic blocking and tackling automation would solve a lot of the problems, instead of me as a completely off customer.
Agreed. Yeah, new service should not be turned up without automated suites running to see if there's a performance difference from an end customer UE standpoint, right? And you would think that that's part of the thing, but as I've learned as well, we still have operators and hyperscalers just launching services and expecting the customers to be basically their test agents, right? And the number
it's cheaper that way.
So Nico,
I was going to say, there's a whole conference on my own personal experience with operators in the UK.
No, I hear you, and it's the same here in the US. Trust me, I have service from all three major MNOs in various forms, and it's surprising, Nico. I think so. Talk a bit about the fact that we are the cheapest part of the automation, sort of work stream, which is and put customers here, put the trouble ticket, put it into the closed loop automation. Customers complain, and then we go look at it, right? So Nico, what do you say to that?
Well, I want to quickly take a stab at, so Francis was mentioning some of the big things around, how do we put a dollar value on these intangible, or I call them indirect benefits as well. I had to sit, as I said, I had to sit with our shareholders, and you look, they want to see numbers. So going through the benefits and the nice feeling stories, saying, in actual fact, our engineers feel more threatened with automation than embracing it. So that was a big hassle to deal with, because that you're automating and taking their work away. So when you sit and trying to work a dollar value, you have to sit with HR and you say, okay, well, what is this engineer worth per hour? And that's how I had to go and do these analysis. I had to say, we're going to save maybe 5 hours in a service activation. 5 hours means $1,000, or argument's sake. And if you do that over 10 services, guess what? Now you've got $10,000 of saving. So that's how we really had to sit and work these indirect benefits out. And then, Francis was talking about churn. I think that's one of the things that we had to sit as well and say, if we're automating something, we have reduced risk of downtime. We've got less errors possibly from engineers that are overworked and doing way too much with way too little time. And again, happy customers will be customers that stay with you. So that's another element that I had to work out and put a dollar value and say, listen, if I have a customer churn of less than 5%, there's a distinct value out of that, and a proper dollar value. So these are the things I had to sit and work out. But as I said, one of the funnier ones was, you want to have people embrace automation, at least in networks, a lot, because you can do a lot, let's say, more with less people. But funny how people go and say, well, the fight against Skynet or the fight against the machine is real, and you're going to take my job away. And it's not really the case. We're actually going to make you, as Francis was alluding, we're going to make you happier, because you're not going to be sitting from 6 a.m. in the morning till 12 p.m. at night every night just doing activations. We're going to take that away from you. So those are the elements that we had to sit and really put a dollar value. And you can, I think you can, with a good chat with an HR lady, no problem.
Yeah. That's so my learning is, make sure that you involve HR in the ROI calculation, business benefits discussion for network automation. That's a new lesson learned. Speaking of Skynet, Gent, let's talk a bit about maybe, sort of the intangibles of network automation that maybe you've seen, some experiences, and then after that, we'll go over to Carlos as we talk about the business case and maybe, are there bad things about automation? But before that, let's get intangibles of network automation. What the intangible benefits you may have seen.
I think we can jump to a lot of intangible benefits, but when in retrospect you start seeing that they're quite tangible, you just weren't able to put together the whole framework of benefits. So our business is full of queuing, right? And the mathematicians will tell us building this network with queues, whether it's a network of processes, everything gets really complicated.
Right.
But one of the big things that we see is, so if you accelerate the speed at which you can go from a lead to an order through fulfillment, inevitably you're going to accelerate revenue recognition. That's worth something. A normal consequence of that, on this topic, is normally the way that you get faster is you go cheaper. The two tend to go hand in hand, because the other stupid option is well, let's build more infrastructure. Let's put more people behind the counter. Let's keep stuffing the counter. And we know very quickly it has the opposite effect. You're increasing costs and you're adding delay. So when we start talking about automation, especially today, virtualization is very frequently part of the formula. The new automation architectures and solution push us into virtualization. So not only do we speed the business process, but we start to eliminate costs, eliminate structure, and simplify. So this is where the intangible comes in. It can get a lot better than we anticipated when you're executing at a peak success rate. So if you get on that really successful path, everything's going right, synergy is getting built, and you're going to accelerate revenue recognition. You're going to drive down your costs, so you're going to get more revenue and less and increased margin because of lower costs. Now what's that going to do? The value that's going to drive is that's going to make you a growth stock, for example. And there's, as we walk through, it's a very complex network of business processes and systems. We keep on going and optimizing, and we get very big network effects on the successful path. And it's not easy to get on the successful path, but if you hit it, you get bigger and bigger accumulative effects.
Yep. I think that's fair. I think if you can find success accelerating that cycle, right, sort of lead to revenue and profits thereafter, right? That's certainly a good thing. But speaking of automation and automation being good, right? So Carlos, can we over automate? Is it possible to actually over automate and then create rigidity in the processes? Is that possible? Have you seen it happen?
You can certainly, you can certainly over automate, right? And that in some ways that seems a little strange, right? Because everybody wants to automate, right? So how can you have too much of a good thing, right? Yeah. But I think we all have to remember that software is a funny business, right? You have two things going on. I mean, you're building a product, right? You're building a business service, and those, like any product, it has a life cycle, right? You go through I think there's another one, it's a kind of like well-known kind of strategic thinking kind of guidance where you say like you go through an inception, and then you go through transformation, then you mature, and then eventually you divest, right? And that's a natural kind of life cycle, right? Software is also a very creative thing, and especially, well, I think we all have to acknowledge, and when I was thinking about that when Nico was talking about people saying like Skynet, and like they're gonna take over my job. Well, what happens when those engineers actually learn that there is no Skynet is you, right? And you are actually creating the automation, right? So then you get all excited, you create, all these things, and all of a sudden it's like, well, but hang on, like what is this part of life cycle thing? And you're gonna like kill my baby. You're almost like I created this thing, right? So, and I think that's where you can have a little bit of a danger when you get so enthusiastic about the thing that you built. You say like, well, I'm just gonna keep it around. I'm gonna keep building it. And at some point, things do reach their natural endpoint, right? So being able to separate that. So I think for me, right, the key, and again, this is not a specific thing to any one endeavor, but it's more like general in software, right? As a software engineer, like separate, the act of creation and sort of like the ability to create these wonderful products, right, from any one product, right? The products will evolve, and then they will divest, right?
Yes.
But then as engineers, as individuals, right, we will improve our ability to create this, right? So maybe it's not, you will always have automation, but don't always automate the same thing. At some point, know where you're supposed to end. It's been a natural stop, and then move on to the next thing.
I think
maybe the next thing in 5 years, we'll be automating, I don't know, IoT devices, right? Or something else. It may not even be networking.
Right. No, I think that's fair. Yeah, I mean, focus on being a better artist and not, being fixated on the fact that the Mona Lisa was your creation and sticking with it, right? And then just be done, right? And I think that's very fair in terms of the process versus the product, right? Of automation. So let's take it over to Francis and talk about maybe, given, I think, Carlos talked about the process and becoming better at automation, and then and being able to sort of move from one product to another. What have you seen in terms of being able to understand that maybe you're at a point of achieving diminishing returns, and then you should basically stop working on this piece of art and move on to the next one, or looking beyond, right? What have you seen there? But before you answer that, I'm going to sort of tee up the panel, maybe sort of get some takeaway points as we wrap up here. Same with Nico, and then same with Carlos. But I'm going to go to Francis first. And then, Francis, how do you know if you're achieving diminishing returns? And then maybe as we have the conversations, a couple of wrap-up points at the end of that as well. So Francis.
I think there's actually from somewhat bitter experience. I think there's three warnings you can look at for is this real? You can always make the ROI. As I say, you can always somehow save 2 hours on a mean time to restoration. But I think the first one I would say is step away if you can't see how the organization is changing. There's a wonderful, it's termed the law, Conway's law, which says that all systems replicate the organizations that they serve. So if you see, and I've worked on a major project for over 2.5 years where something which was meant to be transformational becomes the existing system. That is, if you can see that in any of it, step away from that one. I think the other thing is just look at how many times have you tried, how many times has this organization tried to solve this problem already? Has it achieved it? Is there anything, it's the Einstein madness question, which is you're doing the same thing and expecting a different result. That's another warning sign you can get. And slightly sort of turning back to sort of, it's this, are you trying to automate or are you trying to mechanize? I in relation to the previous question, I certainly believe you can definitely over mechanize. I don't believe you can over automate. And a properly automated solution is one that is actually meant to react to change, not simply mechanize the status quo. So again, if a warning sign would be, am I simply mechanizing the status quo? I think would be my,
very fair.
Those would be my 3 warning signs.
Very fair. Very good. Let's go to Gent, and then let's do Carlos, and then Nico. I'll let you wrap up with the last word as we run out of time here. So Gent, any sort of key takeaways or key lessons you want to leave our audience with?
Yeah, let's get straight to the critical path to revenue recognition. So assuming you have a clear idea of how you want to service your customers and grow your revenue, we get straight to how are we going to go from lead to order to fulfillment,
yep.
And then revenue recognition.
Yep.
And what's the cost of that? So that's fairly simple. We want to reduce costs. But if we have a critical path, if we have a task in fulfillment that can't get shorter, you may be able to drive down your costs via automation, but you might not accelerate revenue beyond that critical path. So it could be that fiber needs to be laid to the customer prem or to the residential facility. There's a big lead time on that, which creates long pull on your critical path. It may be that you need to launch satellites. It may be that you need to trench fiber for submarine cables. So those critical paths on your lead to order to fulfillment is really important, because it means at one extremity, automation is only going to reduce costs and maybe improve the customer experience so you get better customer retention, but you won't get the revenue acceleration. If you need that revenue acceleration to scale your business, it is really important to benchmark your processes and understand them.
Right. Very fair. Benchmark, understand where the key tentpoles are, or the long lead time items are, and find a way around them, or parallelize the process, or do something else. Otherwise, you're not going to get the revenue acceleration that you expect from automation. Very good. Carlos, sort of key lessons, key takeaway, key thoughts for the audience?
I would say encourage safe experimentation, like define like almost like safe experiments, but also ones that you can take all the way through some kind of live environment. and build measurements around that, sort of learn from that and say like, did I actually gain the improvements that I thought I was going to get? Did I get the efficiencies I thought I was going to get? Right. In some ways, we can sit and debate a lot about models, right? Sort of, and kind of trying to think about different scenarios that would happen, right? But sometimes you just need to try things, right, in a safe way, right, to learn.
Got it. Understood. And I think that's a key thing, right? Which is automation doesn't mean that you lose agility. That's very good. Nico, you have the last word here, so let's make it good. Nico, the key
what an honor
for the audience.
What an honor. Thanks.
So don't mess up, Nico. Not now, right? Not that we've come so far. It's all up to you. No pressure.
Great stuff. No pressure. So I think the very first thing that comes to mind is that business case. Now I know for engineers and for technical people, a business case tends to be a financial hassle and something that we don't like to do. But if you embrace the idea of a business case and use it as a discovery tool to discover processes within your organization, then take those processes and look at them and say, which of these ones can actually be automated? Because not every process can be automated. Telcos can tell you this all the time. And then once you take that, and then you look at your investment requirement to automate it, look at that and just say, is it really worth automating? And I'm a big proponent of automation, but in some cases, you just end up doing nothing because it is really the easiest way to save costs. And just keep in mind that as much as we love automation and we're pushing automation as much as humanly possible, sometimes practically speaking, it's just not worth it. And where it is, you definitely get a supreme amount of benefits doing it quickly.
Very good. That was actually very insightful. I think you've done the panel proud. So so with that, I'd like to thank the panel and for taking the time with us today. Again, thank you, Gent. Thank you, Francis, Carlos, and Nico, especially for wrapping us up. And once again, thank you to the Layer123 folks for organizing this conference, and thank you especially to the audience for having been with us today. Bye for now.